All right, everybody. Welcome to another Sunday night edition of Beyond the Court. This is episode 20. We're really excited to be here with you guys and everybody and ladies. It's the week before Thanksgiving, and we'll get into that in a second. But before we do, tonight's guest will be the one and only Todd Boss. And I can tell you that not only you are asking yourself exactly who is he and what does he do, but Ellie and I and Veronica right before this said, hey, who exactly is he? So, Ellie, what do you got?
Yeah, Todd's an interesting guy. We don't know a lot about him. We're going to learn a little bit about his history in racquetball, but we do know this: he's a master when it comes to stats. He's got a lot of the statistics on both tours and the history of the sport internationally as well. And that's a lot of work that he's put in, a lot of years that he's put in on this. And so I'm curious to learn about that. And a lot of questions that we have, not just about the stats and the records and all that, but also, about the sport and what's going on nowadays. And nice guy. I don't know him well. You don't know him that well, obviously. And so let's get to know him a little bit better tonight.
Yeah, he's been around a long time, but before we get to him, we're gonna get our little monologue in here, and I call this the Ellie log because Ellie was the one that talked me into doing this, about 18 episodes ago. So this week is Thanksgiving, and Thursday's Thanksgiving, and it's definitely a difficult one for many of us, and I'm sure it's difficult for you and for many to feel festive or to celebrate. Many might not even be allowed to celebrate, right? Depending on what state, what city we're in. This is certainly unlike any Thanksgiving any of us have seen in our lifetimes. And I mean, any of us. I don't care if you're, 60, 70, 80, 90. If you're celebrating your 50th wedding anniversary this Thursday, Dave and Pat Ellis, that is something to be thankful for and grateful for. Happy anniversary to you too. Wouldn't it be great to put this year just in the closet, just for this week? Let's put 2020 away. Let's go hide it. And let's just try to have a good week, and really try to focus on what you might be thankful for. We are thankful. There are things, if you think about it, that we're thankful for. And I know it's difficult. And, if you can't be with friends and family and loved ones, you can do it just like this, do it online. And guess what? I know it sucks. It's not the same, but that's okay. Embrace it, do it the best you can, have a glass of champagne, have a glass of iced tea, whatever it is that you like. But, at the end of the day, we truly are all in this together because we're all going through it. And it's not all doom and gloom. There's vaccines coming and there's some good things happening. Obviously, I know in the States, we're backtracking a little bit, but that was expected also. And don't forget, it's Thanksgiving. So do the best to be thankful, enjoy it, have fun the most you can. And remember this, and this is something that I always preach and I always talk about, whether it's in coaching in the court, whether it's life coaching, whether it's friends and family. There's only two things every day when we wake up and open our eyes that we can control. That's our attitude and our output for the day. So that's up to you. That's up to us. And just remember that, when you wake up tomorrow and this week, the only two things you get to control is your attitude and your output. And it's up to you how your day goes, how your week goes, how others see you, how you see others. So we hope you have an amazing week. Dave and Pat Ellis, happy 50th anniversary. On Thursday, you guys got married 50 years ago. I mean, that just makes me smile. It makes me smile outside and inside. That's just incredible and admirable. We love you. And we'll be right back with our guest. And that's going to be Todd Boss. All right, everybody. So here we are with the famous Todd Boss. And Todd, let's be honest. I'm just gonna pull no punches. We've known each other for a very long time. You've been in the sport for a very long time. But with that said, you're like a mystery man. You're like 007. You live in Virginia.
Mhm.
You're clearly incredible on the tech side of things. I said this before, I was taking some notes, and without you and the stats that you've put together, nobody else has done this in the history of the sport. We wouldn't have these things. And there's a lot of people out there that just don't know who you are. So the first question I have for you, and no offense, because I get it all the time with a name like Sudsy, Todd Boss is just too cool of a name. Is that your real name?
That is the real name. Absolutely. I wanted to say thank you guys for having me. I think that the name Boss, my dad and his mom did a ton of genealogical research. Believe it or not, we 10 generations in this country. We go back to the mid 1700s in kind of rural Pennsylvania, and Boss is German. We came from Bavaria, in kind of like around where Munich is, and apparently, allegedly, we're somewhat related to Hugo Boss, the clothier, although I somehow doubt
You
that.
shouldn't say that, because you're going to get 1,000 phone calls and texts from every racquetball association saying that they want you to get them a sponsorship.
I don't know. I don't think I somehow doubt it. We can't prove it, but that'd be cool if it was true.
Just go with it. It is cool. All right. So I'm going to ask you a tough one again right away. Tell everybody truthfully, do you work for the CIA?
No, I have never worked for the CIA.
Okay. Fair question.
But allegedly my sister does. So.
Okay. See, so I'm not shocked.
I still go to bossconsulting.com when I want to look up the racquetball stats, and I know there's a better way, a more direct way for me to do that. But that's when I first noticed your site and all the hard work that you put into it. But, I go to that first, and then I start just creeping around that for a second, and I pull up the clientele, and it's, federal, U.S. Office of Personnel Management, Federal Communications Commission, Department of Labor, Department of Defense, Department of State, U.S. Department of Agriculture, information services, reads similar software. So, it's incredible. But it's, the site doesn't jump at you or anything like that. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do for a living and who Todd Boss is off the racquetball court.
Sure, you bet. So yeah, as you surmised, I am an IT consultant. I specialize in database and data solutions. Generally speaking, what you saw was kind of like a past list of organizations that I've worked for, and it spans a gamut. I've done a lot of federal work. I've done DoD work. I've worked for state. I'm just rolling off of a project for Medicare, where I had a database that literally had a record of every Medicare or Medicaid recipient in the United States, and we kind of tracked their patient assessments as they went through the system or whatever. Yeah, my website design skills are not fantastic. Primarily, I use Boss Consulting for the email. Right. I actually was just talking with a partner who told me that I needed to spruce up my website because it looked like it was designed in about the 1990 time frame or so, which is true. But yeah, that's what I do for a living. I'm rolling off of the Medicare contract, and I'm getting ready to work on a project for SiriusXM, which is going to be kind of neat. Yeah. So in my job, I work for a bunch of cool different things. I've worked with all kinds of interesting data, some of which is I've needed clearance for. So when I worked for DoD and state, I maintain clearances. I did some consulting for ATF that required some clearance work. But a lot of the times I'm just kind of working with normal data and yeah.
All right. Yeah, you just summed it up for us. Definitely CIA or NSA. That's fine. You don't have to admit it, but we'll go CIA. It's all good. So Todd, we do the work you put in. Truly, thank you. It's amazing. I would be lying if I didn't tell you I've dabbled in there too. To look at some stats and I have to ask you. So, are there any events or years that you think you're missing or incomplete, and you have these incredible racquetball stats that if we didn't have that, and let's make sure that everybody knows that website too. Let's put it in the chat room or whatever we need to do there, Scotty. But, do you have any years missing or events missing? Do you feel things are incomplete, or what's your take
Absolutely. Absolutely. So and if you want, I can kind of give you an overview of like how the site started, which kind of explain why there's holes, because it kind of tells the story of racquetball in general. So the story goes like this. I am, and this kind of ties into my connection to the sport. I started playing in the early 90s, played in college. When I got out of school, I joined a gym. The gym I joined specifically was the Sport Fit Laurel Club, which is a pretty
Oh,
famous club.
sure.
Unfortunately, just closed after being in business for 30 some odd years, but was a regular host of ladies and men's pro stops for decades.
Casualty of COVID, right? The closure.
Exactly. Yeah. Kind of a shame. But anyhow, I played for a few years, started playing tournaments, moved to Arlington, Virginia in '98, and when I moved to Arlington, Virginia, I got installed as a teaching pro, and I was still single. I lived with a couple other racquetball guys whose names a lot of people may or may not know if they're East Coasters. One was a guy by the name of Kurt Rettke, and another fellow by the name of Ben Hale. Both open level players, good solid players. Kurt was like a top open player in Jersey in the early '80s. Like played with Jim Cassio, that kind of level of play. And Kurt was a pack rat. Kurt had saved every single national racquetball and racquetball magazine that he had ever gotten, dating to the late '70s. So as we started, three guys just kind of hanging out, talking racquetball. And so for a time frame, for perspective, this is late 90s, this is 98, 99 time frame. And they were telling me that there was an argument or a disagreement about who was the men's pro champion in '77 and who was the men's pro champion in '82. And I found this to be mind-boggling because in '77 and '82, that was like literally the heyday. That was the growth, the explosive growth of the sport. It was, this everybody in the country was playing this sport. And I'm like, how is it possible? That's like you telling me that there was a dispute over who was the pro golf champion in 1995 when Tiger Woods was huge, or in 1998 when Tiger Woods, or 97 when he won 3 of the 4 majors. So did a little digging. As it turns out, I worked with Team Ed, who ran tournaments back then, and we hosted our website at Dave Peck's hosting company. Well, Dave Peck was the '82 champion. So I call up Dave Peck and I'm like, Dave, why is there a disagreement about who won in '82? He's like, there's no disagreement. I won in '82. I'm like, okay, but why would there have been a disagreement? And turns out it's because Hogan won the Nationals. And from 75 until 81, whoever won the Nationals was the champion, right? In '82, they went to a points-based system. Peck won the points fair and square, but Marty won the Nationals, which is also the biggest payday, and easily out-earned Peck on the season. So over the course of years, some people had claimed that therefore Marty was the true champion in '82. I'm like, okay, I get that. That makes sense. But what about '77? He's like, well, you probably should go talk to Bledsoe. I'm like, okay, call up Bledsoe. I'm like, so Bledsoe, who was the champion in '77? I was the freaking champion. I beat Hogan in the Nationals. I'm like, okay, but why would there have been a disagreement? He goes, well, because Hogan went 44-1, and his only loss to me was in the Nationals, and he finished the season ranked number 1. So, he could probably claim he was number 1. I'm like, okay, like this is ridiculous. I can't believe that in a sport like this. And remember, in this time frame, we're talking about the late '90s. Racquetball's still big, right? This is right in the middle. This is the beginning of the Cliff Sudsy era, where there was just this huge rivalry and driving interest in the sport. There were still tournaments every weekend. We were still getting open draws of 40, 50 men and tournament sizes of 200 people just in a local club tournament to compete for $300. Like this is ridiculous. So I start digging around and I come in contact with a fellow by the name of Drew Stoddard. Drew Stoddard, for those who don't know, was the editor of the Racquetball magazine in the mid '80s. And when the Catalina Tour collapsed in '82, after the '82 season, there was technically not really an official tour. And so what happened was the Racquetball Manufacturers Association, or RMA, they organized the tour for a few years in the mid '80s. So this is right in the height of the Yellen era. And so Drew Stoddard was not only the editor of the magazine for a couple of years, he was the tour commissioner. So I get to talking to him about the same kind of issues. And he goes, by the way, I have a spreadsheet with a bunch of match results dating, from the '70s and '80s. Do you think you'd be interested in that? I'm like, absolutely. I'm a data guy. And so he sends me the spreadsheet, and it's sure enough, it is all of the sanctioned events from the beginning of the Pro Tour, which was in August or September of '74, all the way to the end of his involvement, which would have been in the spring of '88. Because if memory serves, or if you guys know, right about that point, Heiser took over and started to organize the tour heading into the fall of '88, and then and then we'll get to what happened then in a moment. But so I was like, well, this is amazing. I've got this spreadsheet of data that covers 2 decades, and I've got a pack rat's stack of magazines that's 3 feet tall. So I literally went magazine by magazine from the end of the spreadsheet to the current day, which would have been, at that point, we're talking about 2002 or so. And I just went through every magazine and transcribed the results for the men's tour. And it just added it in. And I would sit in my house at night and watch TV and be with my computer and just type stuff in, and it took a while, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
And you did this just because of your love for the game.
Just for the heck of it. I don't know. I sense that, and for anybody who works in IT or works with data people, we're a little bit psychotic sometimes when it comes to like, completing something or getting something to, making sure that it just killed me that I had this spreadsheet of data and it wasn't up to date or wasn't completed. So finish the spreadsheet. Now I've got this huge match results database. And I think it had at that point something like 20,000 match results over the course of time. And so I put it onto a database online. And this was all at the time hosted at the Boss Consulting site because I hadn't branded it Pro Racquetball Stats yet, or hadn't done anything. And I put a little front end against it so that to this day, the same program still runs. It's a Perl program. You go to it and it kind of dynamically creates a web page, and you can pull up results per event or per season or per player, or just kind of overall tour-wide statistics, and what I did is I load the spreadsheet into a simple table, and the table literally just has per match, winner, loser, round, score. So, Sudsy beats Cliff, 1, 2, and 3 in the finals. And then I've got the tour, the date of the event name or the tournament name, the city it was in, and then the source and the season. And so literally it's 10 fields, and everything that you see on the website is literally driven from those 10 fields in one table for the most part. So I started writing reports. The first one that I wrote was show me every final that's ever occurred on the Pro Tour. That's literally the first report that I did. And it's still there on the website. You can run all finals. And from the beginning of time, the first final was, I believe it was Surratt over Brumfeld in San Diego in September 74, all the way up to the current day. And from that point forward, just, I published the data onto Meet and Play, which was like the Reddit board or the Facebook board of the time.
Meet and Play. And that has a history to it itself.
It does.
Willie Tilton.
At Willie, Willie's old website. And everybody was on it. Marty was on it.
Everybody was there. And there was a lot of fake people on it that we don't know who was who, right?
Drop Shot 25 was on it. Whoever the heck that guy was. That's
Todd, I have to interrupt you because, it sounds like you put hundreds of hours into this, no doubt about it. And you really, for Racquetball, if you haven't been to Todd's website, go check it out. It's really cool. Did anyone ever offer to pay you for this work or compensate you to continue to do what you're doing?
No, a couple times here and there, I would talk with specific players who, we'll leave them nameless, who wanted to like co-opt it or brand it, or maybe do something so that that would have involved money, maybe. But my take was always that, look, that really wouldn't make any sense, because it wouldn't make any sense to have one player who would own all this data and make it unavailable for anybody else, especially when I started to add in more than just the men's Pro Tour. For a little while, I was talking to Menino when Menino was running the IRT, because I was like, okay, well, to me, it really makes sense because, again, for many years, it was just IRT data. I thought that it should be part of the IRT website. So we talked briefly. I did talk with Menino briefly about maybe trying to, pull it into the IRT-tour.com site, or to maybe I could have branded it alongside with like the look and feel of the IRT to make it look like it was part of it. But we didn't really get anywhere, for obvious reasons. That kind of thing would have been a significant commitment of money and resources. And really, the IRT Tour website really just exists to publish events and rankings, and that's about all that it can handle. And so eventually, I started getting some pressure to say, well, why don't you have this for the women? And so for many years, starting in '09, I started to collect the women's pro data. And then, as it turned out, the guy who writes the Racquetball blog in Canada, Evan Pritchard, he had gotten his hands on, or he had collected a bunch of women's pro data that he shared with me that allowed me to kind of build a women's database, that, at least of some semblance of the data. And so then from 2009 forward, I have perfect captured data for the Women's Pro Tour. And
Perfect. So you're not missing a thing.
not from 2009 forward, not missing a thing.
That's pretty cool.
And so then from there, we started to add in. I say we because it's just really me. Started to add in the international data. I got a big dump of data from Tim Baghurst, who was involved with the IRF for a while. And he's like, hey, I have this, I maintain this. Do you think you could load this up and write queries off it? I was like, absolutely. So I did that. And then for a while, there was really good IRF data. And then I eventually replaced Tim's data with the conventionally loaded IRF data so that it matched what we did for the IRT and the LPRT. I added in categories so that you could do things like, hey, show me all the women's champions of only the Pan American Racquetball Championships events, from the beginning in the early 80s to now. And so then, boom, you can just get a category like list. Once I got categories, I added in amateurs, and then I added in juniors. And then when the WRT founded, I was like, I didn't load WRT data for like 2 years because I just thought it was, just like nothing. But then it turned out, no, these guys are serious competitors. So I went back through all the R2 sports and built the WRT data, talked to Pablo, and Pablo gave me a bunch of good data there as well. And now, and then the last thing I've added is outdoor data. So now, as of this moment, there's more than 42,000 match results from more than 3,300 tournaments in the history of racquetball. A tournament being like a bracket. So if it's a pro, if it's the IRT, it's one bracket. In juniors, they have 18, 16, 14, 12s, 10 double bounce, 8 multi-bounce, 6 multi. So a junior tournament results in there being, for boys and girls, like 20 tournaments, as you can imagine. But that's why there's 3,300 tournaments in the database. Any
collaboration with R2 Sports on any of this? This comes from your tech buddy in the background, Scotty Mack.
No, Ryan and I talked so I met Ryan actually before he'd even commenced with R2 Sports. And his system was live for many years before I even thought about doing this. And so I never really approached him because I kind of knew what the answer would be. And now, and it's actually, he and I recently did chat about maybe trying to, build a way for me to like suck the data in so I didn't have to do the manual data entry. And the reason I'm approaching him now as opposed to before is because, well, to do an IRT event as it goes forward, it's like one draw. It's 30 men that enter it, and I can predict the draw in 5 minutes and doing the spreadsheet entry. And as a fan, I want to do that anyways. I'm like, hey, I want to see what the 16s are going to project out to, and what are the quarters going to look like, just as a fan. But to go back and like, if I wanted to go back and fill in, for example, like all the past junior tournaments, I mean, it is such a significant amount of data entry. So I called him recently and I was like, hey, what do you think it would take to get this done? And unfortunately, there's significant privacy concerns, as you might imagine. The R2 Sports engine is just kind of a database that services all the sports that he has. Pickleball, bowling, cornhole. He's got 20 different sports that are in there. And the players' databases with, and there's significant PII, personally identifiable information in the player database within the R2 Sports. You've got birthdays, you've got home addresses, you've got phone numbers and email addresses. So you can't just give that access that to anybody, even if you're trustworthy, like I hope that I project to be.
I mean, you've had clearance from all the top state government organizations. There's no doubt. You now officially have clearance with Beyond the Court, Ellie and I. So whatever you need, Todd, you just let us know. You're cleared.
Yeah. So we could probably still work on a way to collect data, but we would need to fund a private API into the database so that I didn't have direct access in for proprietary reasons. And who's gonna fund that, right? I'm not really interested in spending money on a passion project any more so than I already have. And the USRA is not going to fund something like that just to make it convenient for me to load up data. So we've kind of put it aside.
This is all really interesting, Todd. You know, I can sit and take this in. You know, I'm kind of out of our group here. I'm a little bit more of the historian of the racquetball. My dad started getting magazines in about '76, and I've collected pretty much all of them. You know, some got away here and there, but I've got a lot of magazines as well. You know, the ones you've seen and collected data from over the years. And you're one of those special guys who really truly loves racquetball. You can tell it's just really deep in your soul, to not just because of the amount of time that you've put in and doing the legwork to make this accessible to all of us to see, but you know, it has to, you know, you're used to doing that with your job, with your business. So that goes without saying that you can handle the stamina of that. But you know, you talk about your passion for racquetball, your game, being on the court, the sport over the years, because you know a lot about it. And then, you know, I've got questions, and we're going to get into this here, you know, and go different angles. But you know, we had to hear that story first in the build up here. So,
yeah.
But talk about your passion for racquetball on the court and just the sport in whole.
Sure. I realized, Sudsy, I didn't actually answer your question. What years do we have holes for?
Yeah, that's a good question. You're right.
For the men, there's kind of a hole in between 88 and 90 because the Pro Tour collapsed in the fall of 88. And then it didn't really pick back up until the spring of 89. And there were events, but there's no record of them. Then the entire 89-90 season, which was the first season that Cliff won.
Wow.
There's really just no data for that. And the reason for that is because at the same time that that turmoil is going on in the men's pro tour, the magazine, the National Racquetball magazine died. It basically stopped. And that was the one that was covering the pro events.
Right.
It got picked. There was an amateur, you know, the AARA at the time, they had a publication called Racquetball Today that then morphed into Racquetball magazine. They specifically refused to cover pro events because racquetball, you know, because politics. In fact, you can go through
a conversation, Todd, that we could have, huh? The three of us.
So for a number of years in the early 90s, there's no coverage of pro racquetball because of this little dichotomy. Then Killshot pops up, right? Killshot pops up. It's this glossy, really well done. As you know, Sudsy, you were on the cover of it like 10 times. And, you know, they covered the men's tour very, very well for, you know, the early to mid 90s. So we're talking Catchstick's title, Ray's title, Cliff returns from tennis. And then the Killshot kind of peters off and dies. But then by that point, Racquetball magazine was itself off of being like this weird kind of newspaper kind of thing to being a real magazine again. And they start covering it again. So the holes that I have, 88 to 89, 89 to 90. And then Sudsy, your first title year, which was, I believe, 93, 94?
Number 196. 95.
Your first title year, oddly, there's a bunch of tournaments where I just only know the final. I don't know any of the round of 64 all the way up. I just know that like you won and you beat such and such and the guy in the final. And so you're shortchanged a bunch of wins in the tournament.
Interesting.
Get my win percentage up. Come on. Yeah. No, we'll get into the stats. My whole stats thought process. But Ellie, go ahead. I know you had a bunch of things there too for talking.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm still kind of waiting to hear, you know, his passion for the game for himself. You know, we're all racquetball players, and that's one of the things that we talk about all the time. You know, Sudsy says we are racquetball, and I bought in early on that in this COVID process with him, and because I live the lifestyle of it still, even though I'm not playing for myself. But your game and what you know, racquetball means to you, for you.
So my passion, you know, I bought into the tournament play very early. You know, I started playing at a very popular club that had incredible leagues, and I was getting competitive. We had leagues that had a number of tournament open players, and I was 3 levels below them in league play when I first started playing. I love going to the tournaments. I love seeing these guys play. You know, the first tournament I ever played at was at a club called Athletic Express in Gaithersburg, Maryland. The club that used to have Jim Daly as a pro, who was one of the best amateur players to ever play in the Virginia area, or in Maryland or Virginia. And I was 23, 24, single, you know, just working and playing racquetball. I would go to the gym at night. I'd go straight from work to the gym, play from 6 until 10:30. I'd leave at 10:30 because the McDonald's by my house closed at 11. So I try to get back to my house to get a cheeseburger at 10:58, eat dinner at 11 o'clock at night, and repeat. I would do that 4 or 5 nights a week. You know, and you know, eventually, you know, you eventually work your way up as a tournament player from, you know, C to B to A to open. And I got lucky when you know, I was kind of a known commodity when I moved to Northern Virginia. I moved to Arlington, and there was a club pro spot that I was recommended for, and I ended up running programming there for 10 years. Leagues, lessons, clinics, shootouts, you know, sanctions tournaments, that whole thing. And, you know, over the course of 10 years, you really learn a lot about, you know, the same thing that any club pro or anybody who runs this kind of programming for a living kind of learns. You know, you want to promote the sport. It's a labor of love. It's not like I'm netting a huge, you know, 1099 every year. You know, you're giving back. You're at the club to try and convince your league of novices, hey, I'm so glad you played. I really want you to play again. I don't have to convince the tournament open player to play the league again. I got to convince the novices to keep it up and keep going. You know, don't get discouraged. I want you to become a C player. I want you to continue to play, not because I'm going to make any money on it, but because we want you to continue to do something that you really enjoy. In that same time period, I helped start the Virginia organization. You know, so I had some experience running, you know, a volunteer-driven organization, the CVRA, it's called. You know, and it kind of stems into, you know, not necessarily opinions on how the national organization should run, but it gave insight into some of the challenges that the national organization has. It gave insight to some of the challenges that any organization in racquetball has. It's all driven by volunteers, right? And so volunteers are not motivated by money. Obviously, they're not getting paid. So what motivates volunteers? You know, the sense of accomplishment, recognition. You know,
Yeah, I was gonna say sometimes ego. You know,
ego. Hey, one of the reasons that we wrote the bylaws the way we did in Virginia, we forced people to age off the board every 3 years.
Love it.
And that's because we were worried about somebody getting installed as the president, having that ego, and not allowing new voices to come in, because that's basically what had happened to the organization before.
Can we do that in U.S. politics too? Have age outs, you know, like in the Senate and the Congress and all that? That's actually a great rule.
You know, but even that being said, you know, hindsight's 2020. There's some downsides to aging volunteers out.
Yep.
You know, I'll tell you a great story. We involved an IT professional, big time racquetball player. He was a web developer when we needed to design the CVRA website, and he designed it all up, and then he presented it to the board, and the board poo-pooed it. They're like, we don't like this. You know, can you change this and that? Well, what do you think that web designer did? He said, okay, fine. Have it your way. Talk to you later. And he didn't finish the project. He never once worked again or did anything for the organization again. You know, and it's because that person was doing that as a favor for somebody, and he was doing it just to try to help out. And the better way to approach that person probably would have been to be like, okay, hey, we really like this, but we want to make some tweaks. You know, do you have some time to make some tweaks? That's how you properly motivate, you know, volunteers. And sometimes when you run volunteers off inadvertently, you know, by doing a term limit, like in a board organization, they never come back. And then suddenly you've lost these people because you've lost their passion. So, you know, if I were to write those bylaws again, I don't know if I would write them the same way. I don't know if I would force people to age off, because we aged off a lot of people who never came back, and maybe that hurt us.
Times are different in racquetball as well. You know, you don't have as many people willing to put some sacrifice into it. So, you know, it's our saying out here is, you know, save our courts. We mean that. You know, we need more people playing. Of course, you know, we need reasons for the courts to still stay as racquetball/handball courts. And sometimes, you know, aging out can age out really good people who have lifelong meaning for the sport. You know, and just the egos aren't always there. So it's a difficult situation, and I've seen it go both ways here in California over the years. And personally, I don't know which direction I want to go with you, Todd, right now. All right. You know, I'm going to get back to that thought here in a second, but okay, what happened with Heiser and Hogan, in your opinion, then in 82, since you brought that up? Or I believe right after 82, you know, Heiser takes over the tour as it's in a hurting stage. I'm assuming Marty didn't love that or love the direction. So what's your story, your you know, we'll talk to both of those guys here in the future as well. But let's say you on that.
So it's interesting.
Todd, I mean, if it's something you don't want to touch
Yeah,
on, you know,
hey.
that's up to you. That's up to you too.
Look, I have, okay. As I collected this information, and I'm looking and I'm looking at the data, and I'm seeing, okay, you have this guy Hogan who just couldn't be beaten basically for 5 or 6 years on tour, and then suddenly, in between the years of '83 and '87, he finishes number 2 or number 3, you know, to Yellen year after year after year, but the results, you know, Hogan beats him more. You know, he's got a career winning record against the guy.
Yes, he does.
And each year, you look at the points, and there's like a different story each year. I don't have any proof that there was you know, chicanery going on in the rankings. I wasn't even involved in the sport. You know, in the mid '80s, I wasn't even in high school yet. But you know, I can show you. I've resisted the urge to do this, to try to go back and figure out the actual points as they were stated they were going to be in each season, and then try to rebuild.
Right.
I do know that, you know, because I've literally read every one of these magazines from the time period as I've gone through and transcribed these tournaments. You've seen quotes in there from players who are like, "Yeah, I don't really understand the point system. You know, it's April, and I might win the tour if I win the last event, or maybe I don't, or I don't even know." Like there seemed like this really kind of this opacity of understanding, even amongst the tour players, about how the ranking points work each year. I had a really long conversation with this about Greg Peck before he passed, you know, because he was right in the middle of it. There was a season where if he had won the last event, he was going to win the tour. And I believe I think it was the 85, 86 season, you know, but he lost in the semis, and he finished 4th in the season.
This is fascinating, guys. I had no idea about any of this, by the way.
Let me say something real quick, Todd. You know, I as a young man, I had the Stockton Pro-Am, as you know, to watch and, you know, play my first pro stop when I was 14. I think I, you know, tried to qualify and didn't win and all that. But you know, my dad was kind of smart enough to get me to go to the meetings, the pro meetings, because I was in the pro draw. I was allowed to go in the meetings. I didn't know what the hell I was listening to. All I knew is that there was some tension in the room, and it didn't feel like Marty had, you know, there was tension in the room. It seemed to be centered around Marty, and at that time, you know, the commissioner, the organizing parties, and I didn't really know anybody other than the names, the players, you know, kind of looking around saying, "I've been following you for a long time," you know, and all that kind of stuff. But you know, kind of more in that mode than truly listening. But I could feel that at the time. So it's kind of interesting to now discuss this a little bit about the Michigan rankings. I mean, the pro rankings, my fault.
Look,
the pro rankings.
There's a number of, and again, I wasn't there. You know, there's a lot of people that are better suited to speak to it. You know, pros who were in those meetings. You know, if you talk to, I don't know, Brett Harnett, I think you'd get an interesting story. You know, Dave Peck will tell you some interesting stories. You know, that's because these guys were not, they were sponsored by a different company, right?
This is news to me. This is crazy.
Didn't care about
when the Catalina tour failed, and there was kind of a free for all, you know, there was definitely there was the Exelon guys, and there were the Pro Kennex guys, you know, and then there were the Leach guys, you know, and for a long time, the Leach guys, you know, Charlie Drake and Marty Hogan were, you know, that was a thing. And there was, as you said, there's tension in the room because these were guys were playing for significant money. Yellen signed $1 million deal. Hogan had a contract. You can talk to Mike Martinez about this. You know, Hogan had a contract that gave him a cut of racket sales, you know, in perpetuity. You know, they were making a ton of money. There was a lot at stake. There's significantly more at stake than there is now, unfortunately. And so, yeah, you know, and what's interesting to me as kind of an outside observer, I'm just looking right at the data. I'm looking at this season and I'm like, okay, Harnett won 4 events. Hogan won 4 events. Yellen won 1 event, and Yellen's number 1. So the only way that can happen, me being the math major that I was if the one win that Yellen got was so overwhelmingly concentrated in terms of points, it was like triple the points of any other tour stop that year, then that would make sense. And actually, that's exactly how Ruben won in '88, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
If you go look at the pro
Wow.
draw from the Grand Fed Pro
Fitty.
Nationals in Seattle in '88, you know, there, I can't remember. If you give me a second, I could probably pull up the draw. But Ruben went into that
This is
thing.
crazy. So, wow, Ellie, you and I had it easy. We knew every round, how many points, what we needed to do, how, I mean, the first year that I finished number one, Todd, I knew exactly what I needed to do to finish number one. And I finished number one by 10 points.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, that leads into another interesting. Okay. So I'm looking at the draw from that tournament. Harnett 1, Swain 2, Ruben 3, Ed Andrews, the 4th seed.
Mm-hmm.
Egan Inouye is the 5th seed. And then Greg Peck, Mike Yellen, and the 8th seed was Hogan. Any one of those top 5 guys, Egan Inouye was ranked number 1 in that tournament or in that season at one point. Any one of those top 5 guys, if they had won that event, they were number 1 that year.
Wow.
And Ruben comes out on top. Ruben, Swain gets upset by Yellen in the quarters. Ruben beats Yellen in the semis and then beats Egan. Egan upset a couple of guys to make the final, and that's how Ruben wins that title. It could have gone 5 different ways.
That's crazy.
There was a lot going on for a good 4 or 5 years there, Suds, before we hit the tour.
Yeah.
So on that note, without getting deep into the Hank Marcus era yet, or talking about Hank specifically yet, how did Hank come in and really kind of help things out for the men's pro tour and clean it up, or whatever you want to call it, however you want to word it?
So Hank comes in and without, I don't want to misspeak, so I'm looking up. So at the bottom of the page, by the way, I've got a bunch of static links that have like tour history and commissioner history. So just so I don't misspeak, Hank takes over as the commissioner in August of '89 when Marty was supplanted. And I say that with all due respect to what apparently happened. Hank was brought in because he was a significant promoter and organizer in the Pacific Northwest. He was the president of Oregon at the time, and he was running big time tournaments. The pros knew him. The pros trusted him. He ran significant events. And what did he do? Well, he brought stability. He brought sponsorship deals. He brought in like an actual tour. He cleared up the point system. I don't think he did a ton of rule changes in that '89 to '90 timeframe. He might have maybe implemented win by 2 in all the games. Like if you guys remember,
we played win by 2.
That's how we played our whole career.
Yeah,
I think that's
win by 2.
Because up to that point it was 3 out of 5, but it was first 1 to 11 and it was win by 1. So you could have 11-10, 10-11, 11-10, and suddenly you had these super tiebreakers all over the place. I think that was one of his big additions from a rules perspective. And I believe it was installed as a private entity, right? The IRT's always been a privately owned entity. It was never like a 501c3 or anything like that. And that was good and bad.
I think it's a no-brainer. I think they should all be private entities and for profit.
Right. And you are not alone. There's a lot of people that,
alone in this chat or alone in the sport.
Well, there is something to be said about the owner of an organization like a pro tour having a profit motive, because
absolutely,
if they're depending on making their mortgage by having a successful tour and then making money, well, then that they're going to be a heck of a lot more motivated than if it's run by some national governing body who has 1 or 2 paid employees and everyone else is a volunteer. Not to imply too heavily what I'm getting at, but what did Marcus do when he left the IRT's employ? He hung around for a couple of years, then he started WAR, right? He builds up WAR. Again, he owns it. It's his entity. It's a corp or an LLC or whatever it was. Again, he's motivated to make that happen. He's motivated to get the partnerships in place. He's motivated to get the tournaments
Smart
in place.
guy.
He's motivated to get the players.
Mm-hmm.
WAR doesn't happen and WAR doesn't generate revenue unless he's signing up all of these guys that have been for 10 years just going to the park, in their tight shorts and playing pickup and not paying a dime to any organization anywhere, right? He changed all that. Sells it to the USRA, gets out, he's tired of traveling. This is now, I think he sold in 3 years ago or two years ago or so. Now look where WAR is. Is WAR continuing to make forward progress? A lot of people would say, WAR needs to be owned by someone who's incentivized to run it.
Yeah, there's no doubt, Ellie, before you jump in, Todd, we've had conversations offline too. And I think one of the things that hurts us as a sport in general are so many organizations are looked at as a charity. And it's like at the end of the day, it's labor of love and everybody's got their hand out saying, gimme, gimme, gimme. But give me that business mentality. And that's one of the things I did like that Jason and Eric really did too, is that they said, no, this is for profit. We're making this, a business. And I'm all for that. All for it.
Look, damn well, Menino was not done playing when the opportunity came for him to become commissioner, when Negretti was eased out, or however Negretti left. What did Menino do? He quit. He took over like basically that day, or he might have played one more pro event, or he might have finished the season. But no, he knew that was an opportunity, and that was an opportunity that led to him running it for. He ran it for 8 years. That was a career.
Well, there's certainly interesting times, with our era for sure. Obviously, I'm sure you're aware of the story of how Hank was then decided to move on from the IRT as commissioner, and how all that. And Sudsy and I were right in the middle of that. And, maybe
that was a tough time.
It was a tough time, sure, but maybe I think. It's Sudsy's point, how he sees it on his stance about the business of racquetball and the private ownership. That brings other questions into play, though, from the player perspective as well, which, a lot of that had to do with our eventual parting of the ways, not to mention we were down a number of stops. And I think Hank would admit that if he was on the call right now too. Yeah, we were down, from 24, 25 stops my first year in 93 down to about 9, and about 6 or 7 of those player driven stops that they could stop at any moment if the player wasn't driven to continue having to stop in his hometown. So that's an interesting conversation, together as well, and for another time, and certainly something that maybe we get on, we have Hank on and we talk directly to the source here, because it's, we've all moved on, and I actually was a major part of the WAR situation, running a couple of the WAR championships there for a couple of years at Huntington Beach and watching him. And he had the support of Echelon initially, and that was important in those times, but you're right. Look where it is now. It's a little different. And, there's a lot of players who aren't as loyal, maybe loyal not being the right word, but aren't as connected to WAR as they were initially when it was building that outdoor vibe to kind of reintroduce outdoor to the racquetball world. Because it did have some moments in the 70s where the best players in the world were going out there. Charlie, Marty, other great players were great outdoor players. Even if they didn't play a ton, they got themselves out there. They're living in San Diego. So it's really interesting history of the sport. And, let me ask you this, because I talk about, I have an opinion, I'll tell you after, but if you were to write the 30 for 30 on racquetball for ESPN, and let's say it's a 2-day show, 1 day, 2 day, 3 day show, whatever it is, what's the story? What's your story for racquetball that the world would need to know?
I'm probably telling it in 2 parts. The first, and it's kind of driven by the eras of the champs, The first 2 parts probably run from the very beginnings of the sport. I'd spend 5 minutes kind of taking it from the invention of the sport in the 40s until the point where it actually got its name in 69. It wasn't paddle rackets anymore. Now it's actually called racquetball, and not with a K, for crying out loud. Stop spelling racquetball with a K.
We agree.
And I'd probably tell the story all the way up until the Cliff Sudsy era. And with all due respect, Ellie, I always just call it Cliff Sudsy. I could call it Cliff Sudsy John. Now on, if you would.
Don't worry about it, buddy.
Cliff Sudsy John Roberts. But I'd probably go that all the way up there, because that is the conversion of the sport from kind of this weird offspring of paddleball to being actually the sport that it is. That is the introduction of Hogan, who takes the sport from this little dink and tactical, 40-shot rallies, almost looks like squash on a 40 by 40 court, to this power game. This, oh my gosh, he's hitting at 140 miles an hour. How the heck is he doing that? And then all the way up through his rivalry with Yellen, and all of the turmoil that happened in '82 with the closed tour, and the contracts and the tour collapsing, and Kendler's influence being ending. That's an hour. That's a part 1.
Yep.
Then I think that you go Cliff to Sudsy, back to Cliff to Kane. You talk about Kane stepping aside for 2 years and then coming back and being absolutely unbelievably dominant. People forget before Kane's suspension, he won the 05 and the 06 titles by the absolute skin of his teeth. It came down to like the final match of the final tournament between him and Jack, and he won both of them, but that was how close that was. He comes back after a suspension and no one can beat him. No one can take a game off him. Now, and you've had him on, and he's talked about this. Now, when he loses a game, not he loses a match, when he loses a game, it's like, oh, is he washed up? Oh, he's 38. He lost a game. That's how unbelievably dominant the guy is. And, the article that was written about him, calling him the Tiger Woods of racquetball, she did a really great job, that writer for the Canadian sports site. And she reached out to me and I gave her some stats for that site or for that story, which she kind of used, I think, but, to help tell that story. And that's how I would probably tell it.
So let me ask you, before I get into my little quick version of it, I've probably mentioned this to Sudsy, and I tell some close friends around here and conversations that come up in racquetball, but what quickly too, not spend a long time, what role do the women at the time play in it? The Lynn Adams, Heather Mckay's, even before them, and how they were being treated in the sport, and into now, the Powell, the Longoria area.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I haven't spent as much time looking at the women's, kind of the women's game, or looking at the women's data. You asked before about holes in the data, and yeah, to be frank, the entirety of like the 80s and the 90s are big holes in the database for the women's data, because I just haven't had a chance to go back through the magazines. They got started, like there was a Facebook post recently, John Faust, who was involved in the sport back then, posted
read it,
article from 1980. And that was a very formative time. From 74 all the way up to that point in 80. Basically, the women's tour was when the NRC, which ran the events at the time, the IRA, which is the precursor to today's USA Racquetball Amateur Organization, the IRA also ran some pro events for a few years, but they got out of the business. Kendler was dominant, NRC was dominant, they had the contracts. And what they were doing is they were pulling in and having women's draws. And so in the early part of it, you had women like Peggy Stedding or Janelle Marriott, or I'm looking up some of the some of the year-end title winners, so to speak. Jan Pasternak, Shannon Wright was really kind of one of the first really dominant players. And as they started to get more attention, they started to want to break away from the NRC, and that really kind of happened in 1980. In that article, if you go back and read it, they mentioned a lawyer who kind of served as their first commissioner. The guy's name was Dan Seaton, and what happened was the women basically went to IMG, which is a huge sports agency that everyone knows because they sponsor a bunch of famous tennis players. They went to IMG and said, "We want you to manage us. We want you to make us a professional tour. Get us away from the men because they're not paying attention to us. They're not giving us the resources we need." So IMG took over, and the women went to them. And this guy, Dan Seaton, was a lawyer who worked for IMG. And he was basically their commissioner for 14 years. That took them all the way to 94. And then I'm not sure exactly what happened in 94, but then by this point, Marcus is running the IRT. And I believe that they made an agreement to basically bring the women back underneath the men's pro tour. It became the WIRT.
Right.
You guys remember that?
Yep, sure.
For 6 years, they ran under WIRT, but again, same kind of problem. The IRT, and look, and this is not a criticism of Hank by any means, but if your job is to run the pro tour and that's what pays your mortgage, and you're having a hard time selling or getting an additional 10 grand out of your sponsor so you can run a women's event, well, what are you going to do? Right. You're going to say, "Sorry, ladies, and I've got 20 men's events and I've got 6 women's events," and that's what was happening. So at some point around 2000, USRA takes over, which is kind of odd if you think about it. The amateur organization takes over. Heiser was involved, and I think it kind of, Heiser started to install a series of commissioners here and there for a while. Ed Willis, who I used to run tournaments with in Virginia, was the commissioner. Stephanie Munger, who was a pro tour player from Alaska, took over. Claude Crocker was involved for a hot minute. He passes to Merle Walker, who was a big racquetball promoter whose name kind of remembers. Finally, the women at the time kind of said, "We're going to take back over." They installed one of their own players, Shannon Feaster,
Mhm.
and she ran it for a number of years, brought some stability. 2006 to 2011, passes it to Gigi Rock, and then Gigi Rock, I don't know exactly what happened there, but soon the players wanted to get it back. They installed TJ, and she's basically been in charge, from 2012 onward.
My dad was involved during some of that period with Shannon Feaster and being her assistant in a sense, and traveling quite a bit with it. So
Yeah.
I was living through some of those times with him. And I was kind of both sides of that story too, on, hey dad, what are you doing? And hey dad, you're doing great. Keep it up. This is great.
So the interesting thing for me about the women's tour is that for as much as we talk about Kane, Paola Longoria is more dominant than Kane.
Yeah.
Better career record, more dominant against all of her competitors. The closest that anyone's ever come to beating, the worst record she has against any other pros against Ronda, and the career record is like 40-9 or something like that. I can pull it up for you right now if you want, but
it's dominant for sure.
It's quite dominant. But the thing is that, again, this is no disrespect for the women, because I hope and I know that some of them will be watching this. When I write some of my previews, when I put a post up about a men's pro tour wrap up and then a women's pro tour wrap up, I hate to say it, but the men's engagement, you can see the numbers on my Facebook, publishing metric site. I get 10 times the volume of traffic for the men's events. They're just,
Why is that?
I don't know.
You can't put a finger on it.
I don't know.
Interesting.
I could speculate, but my speculation may sound harsh or
speculate.
Xenophobic. I think that this is my speculation, and again, this is no disrespect to any of the players involved, but the women's tour is now basically dominated by non-Americans, right?
But isn't the men's tour also?
It is, but Kane lives in Texas, and Rocky's still number 2, and and Landa, he lives in Texas too, and he's just switched over, you're right, and I wonder if the men's tour isn't going to be exactly where the women's tour is when Rocky and Kane in particular retire, because when Rocky and Kane retire, you're going to have De La Rosa, Landa's getting too old too, but you're going to have guys like De La Rosa, Parilla, Montoya. Those are going to be your top 3. I don't know how long Kane and Rocky can play. They probably can play another 5 years more.
Yeah, we that comes up a lot, Todd. I'm curious what you think about that, because obviously we do a lot of consulting also, for some different organizations. But one of the things when you call it the Cliff era and Sudsy and Ellie, you had all these Americans dominating the sport, and all the money was coming in from the States. And it seems to have really slowed down a lot, since those times. And I agree with you. I think that, looking to the future, it's important that we do, look at how do we grow those guys? How do we make them superstars? How do we educate them? How do we help them, maximize their potential and market themselves? And, I think, and it's interesting that you say that about the women's tour, because I say it openly. I think they have a phenomenal product. As far as great players, the girls are great. They look good out there. They're tremendously athletic, like we've never seen, and they're very personable. So what's the problem?
I don't think it's for anyone who thinks that the women's game is a lesser product, I would say to you, go watch them play.
It's not. I agree. I agree with you.
I mean, I was an open level tournament player as a man. I would not have been able to score on these women, on these top women. Vargas and Salas in particular, they hit it as hard as any male player that I ever played against in my open career. I mean, save somebody like Mitch Williams, who was hitting it 160 or something like that. Maybe
a little bit of a stretch on that statement.
They whack it.
So and with that, Ellie, I want to hear your 30 for 30, and for any of the guests that are watching that don't know what 30 for 30 is, ESPN does, kind of just a story on specific things. And he asked Todd, I love the way you describe it. Mine's a little bit different. Mine would be kind of a rah, look at this incredible, eye-opening, jaw-dropping sport because, I've sat with big executives from companies, whether they were American Express or Hilton or Goldman Sachs, and every one of them say the same thing. They say, this is so amazing. I had no idea what this sport was like until sitting here live, watching it, hearing it, the sounds, the smells.
Yeah.
But my 30 for 30 would talk about that. It would touch on some of the champions and the stories of some of the players, but it would really then focus on, well, why didn't it really succeed, or hasn't it the way it should have, and who's responsible?
That's your third installment.
Right.
No, but you're right. It's a fantastic question. I was kind of leading towards well, where are we going? What is the Pro Tour facing? If
It's
you're
not just the Pro Tour, though. You know that, Todd. It's USA Racquetball. It's LPRT, IRT. It's IRF.
True. No, it's true. But I something that Doug Ganem said once on a podcast on the Dylan Reed podcast really stuck with me, and he was talking about because Dylan asked everybody, how do you grow it? I think you guys, have you both been on his podcast by now? I think maybe not. Anyway, Ganem.
I think so. I think
yeah. Ganem said, look, we talk a lot about, investing in juniors and, getting sponsors or this, that. He's like, no. The demand drives the engagement.
Agreed.
The demand for the sport drives engagement. If suddenly these clubs that have been pulling these courts for all these years, if suddenly they had a bunch of people come up to them and be like, hey, we want to play more racquetball. We've got all these people that want to pay and want to earn you money and play racquetball. The club's going to build the courts, right?
Yeah,
that's exactly why the courts got built. And interestingly, racquetball got huge in the 70s, into the early 80s, and then the courts started getting built.
Mm-hmm.
When did all these courts start getting built? They got built in the 80s. They weren't built when the sport was exploding in the 70s. It trailed it, right? So even if we had a blow up now, we'd still have like a trailing effect of it for so. Maybe the better question is how come they didn't? You're right. How come they didn't capitalize? How come they weren't able to move forward from that bulge of time in the 70s into the 80s? That's probably when they lost the momentum in a certain respect.
So my story tends to agree with Doug a little bit more, and it doesn't have quite that question at the end. It's more grave at the end, although I don't live that lifestyle. I don't believe that necessarily, but to tell the real story, I have a title for mine too, and I'll curse a little here, but my title is Jane Fonda fucked racquetball. And I mean that, like, okay, she's not the story, of course, but jazzercise, aerobics, changing the courts for the next thing in the health club industry started this process. Obviously the speed of the game, the rackets getting bigger, but I agree with you. The first installment is the story. Like, what sport reaches its peak level of popularity 12 to 15 years in, it literally like 8 to 15 years in, and then starts this slow downhill and then accelerates big time, in the mid 90s, early 90s, mid 90s, as we're now in our era. So it's, we lived through that in our pro career, watching the number of tournaments go down and all of it being connected to the clubs, the club players, the clubs making money, the club pros no longer existing, that job in the club no longer existing, no reason to really promote the sport and nothing happening to promote the sport, and so that's the story. I mean, what sport does that? What sport has done that and then starts to slow dive into the grave here? And it's just crazy because at the same time, you have all these phenomenal personalities that play pro racquetball on both the men's and women's side. I mean, you really do. You with Brumfield doing it like he did it, Hogan doing it like he did it, Clifford being, just a crazy competitor, Sudsy. I mean, Sudsy doing it like he did it. Now Kane and the players in between and all that. So it's really unique. And it's now the story has changed. The story has gone into this. Well, the sport is now thriving in certain areas of Latin America. Now, thriving is easy to say when there's not a lot going on in the United States that's on a positive status. So, maybe it's not thriving as much as we tend to think in Latin America and Central and South America, but it certainly feels like that. Certainly in Bolivia, it has its major, momentum going right now. But what's next? Where, do some of these countries think they're at their their peak spot here, or do they have plans to go further and further? So it's a really interesting story, and I don't have a happy ending to it. And, you know, does Elvis play a part in it because his clubs don't get built? Sure, that's a cool story that we all have seen. You know, that little piece on, but you know,
Well,
that's what I think about it.
well, so here's a question for you, and it kind of ties into you know what we've just been saying. Pro tours right now starting to become dominated by Central and South Americans, but all of the tournaments, I say all as a generalization, but almost all the tournaments are in the United States, funded by the United States. You know, we had to pull teeth just to get a tournament in Bolivia. You know, the men haven't had a men's pro tour event in Mexico in a decade. Why? If the sport is so big in Central and South America, why aren't they doing more tournaments? Why isn't the tour spending half their time in Mexico, in Bolivia, you know, in Argentina, in Colombia?
So Todd, that's a great point. But let me tell you, you know, obviously coaching and living in Ecuador and South America, and Ellie, I know you know this, and this comes to a shock to a lot of people. These countries outside of the United States, they are not driven by professional racquetball. They're driven by the amateur results. And these countries get funded. You know, you see a lot of comments, you know, in the chat box, and things come up and they say, well, why doesn't the US fund racquetball the way Mexico does, or the way Guatemala does, or the way Ecuador does? My wife goes and wins the US Open. They're not as impressed or as excited if she goes and wins a Pan American gold medal. That's just a fact, you know, whereas we're all about the amateur and international stuff. And, you know, we do a bunch of interviews for the app, and many of the international players, one of the questions I ask is, okay, Todd, would you rather a US Open trophy, you know, win the US Open, or a Pan American Games gold medal? And 98% of the international players, I can almost say 100%, say Pan American gold medal.
Wow, that's true too. That's true.
This is true.
But if you ask any United States of America players, you know, and maybe even Canadian players might even fall into this in the past, you know, would you rather have that gold medal from a Pan Am Games, or just one more tier 1 pro stop victory? Doesn't even have to be, you know, the US Open.
But they also get so incentivized. Do you have any idea how much per medal, gold medal, Team Mexico got for Lima, Peru, the Pan Am Games? It was over $20,000 per gold medal. Do the math. So how do you compete with that, right? So this is why you're not seeing those events. And here's the other thing. They have a lot of pride. And the truth is, as much as, let's say, Mexico says, you know, hey, Perea could be one of the best, guess who's going to go win the event? Kane's going to go win the event if he's there. So that drives the market too.
Well, so here's the interesting question. You know, we've talked about, you know, what's going to happen in the next, you know, does racquetball have a dominant player problem? Would racquetball be more compelling if Kane and Paola didn't exist and there was more competition at the top and you didn't go into every tournament knowing who was going to win? Does that factor into this?
I mean, I like dominance. Look at every sport, every major sport we've ever seen. Look at the history of our sport. There's always been, I think that Kane and Paola are good for the sport. I think they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. I would question, is the sport doing for them what the sport needs to do? And this is not a pointing a finger at the IRT or USA Racquetball. I would say it's much bigger than that. And I'll never forget having the same conversation with Jerry McInnes at ESPN when he said to me, Sudsy, just go be you. The sport will follow. Never really happened, you know? Yeah. And so I would say, no, I think Paola and Kane are excellent for the sport and they should be part of it. And, you know, no, I'm not, it's not about like, let's see more competition. If these guys are kicking ass and Paola's kicking ass, well, then everybody else should go get better. But are they motivated to go get better? Are they driven? You know, what's their reason?
I mean, I asked that as a rhetorical question, I think, because if their presence was truly detrimental to the sport, then we wouldn't have a tour. We wouldn't have people striving to keep playing. We wouldn't have, right now on the men's tour, you have more young players than you've had in years. Like there's just so many players that the draws at the IRT events this year were massive. They were up 20% from the previous year. event over event, you know, and maybe part of that is because the WRT ended, and so suddenly there was less of an outlet, there were certainly fewer local Mexico events because the WRT ran a bunch in there, but those guys were traveling, they were coming to America, they were competing, and in a lot of cases they were getting good wins.
Do you know what? Well, here's another little factoid. So these international countries use the professional tours as training events for the big international events. So these guys are funded. One of the things we need to look forward to is, hey, okay, this is great. What do we do when these countries start to say, we can't fund your players? Like in Ecuador right now, they're not getting paid like they once were. I mean, no, that's the truth. I mean, Ellie's showing you our Pan American gold medal. Ask him how much money we got paid for that.
I think $2,500.
$2,500. You know how much Mexico got for one?
And a bunch of phone calls from Jim Winterton, like nonstop prior to the event.
25 grand. So, you know, think about it. Like those are some of the things we need to look at. So, you know, for the people that say, hey, why doesn't US fund, you know, racquetball, or why don't they support it the way these other countries do? You know, there's some of the answers right there. But,
no, I agree. And you know what might help that? And you touched on it before, Suds. You talked about how you've spoken with major companies. Imagine a world where USA Racquetball, the amateur organization, didn't depend entirely on tournament fees for its revenue sources. Imagine a world where they had an overarching corporate sponsor, you know, providing support for the organization, providing for salaries, providing basically a safety net so that they could actually operate like an NGB should, right? Then maybe they would be setting aside, you know, stipends so to support athletes so they could go travel. They wouldn't have to go down the freaking list of you know, national team members to find somebody to go play at the park next year, right? That's happened.
It's going to happen again.
You know, it's going to happen. So
yeah.
You know, so you talk about talking to these companies, and it ties into the problem with our tournaments. Right now, tournaments are basically scraped together by local tournament directors who are calling their buddies, asking their buddies for $500, asking the My Pillow guy for $1,000. There's no overarching plan, and if they can get $17,500 together, boom, they have a pro stop. That's great. That's not sustainable, as you very well know. You know, instead, you need somebody to underwrite the entire tour to make it coordinated. You know, so how do we do that, right? I look at, and I'm going to use an example which I know a lot of people hate using, but I watch a lot of squash on TV, right? It's the same thing that we have. It is a ball on a court with players that are traveling all over the country. They have a portable court that they have the funding, and they travel and they carry this court all over the freaking world, and they watch it play, right? So what's the difference? Squash's tour has 22 times the amount of money that the IRT has. I went and looked up their purses for the year. 22 times. How is that possible? Who is underwriting them, right? It's and my conclusion is just simply that squash's demographics are different than racquetball. Squash is an elitist sport, Ivy League, Wall Street, so they're underwritten so that's who underwrites them, right? What is racquetball in the United States? It's a middle-class sport. So why aren't we going after corporate sponsors that make sense to speak to the people that play racquetball? The middle-class sponsors. Who are they?
Todd, that's a great question. And it shows, you know, in the history of our sport, there's one guy that's been able to do that, and that's Doug Ganem. And obviously we're going to be losing him soon. And listen, you know, everybody that's out there, they're doing, I think, what they believe is the best they can for our sport. And I know you know this, Todd, and you may be getting an invite to this too. We're trying to, you know, myself, Scotty Mack, and Ellie, we're trying to put that summit together with the leaders in the sport and people like yourself that have the knowledge to come to the table, because yeah, it sucks when people just want to say problems and have no solutions, but we want to open up a think tank and have these difficult conversations all together. This summit's going to happen. You know, it's not everybody's going to love what they hear in this summit. It's going to be private, although I did toss it around going live, which that's a whole nother story, because really what is there to hide? You know, like if we don't do it now, when are we going to do it? And, you know, I think that to your point, you know, everything you've said tonight is money. I love it. But I also think that, okay, now we need to take action right now. We need to do something about it. And, we have to look around and we have to look in the mirror and we have to look at each other and go, are you the right guy for this? Is she the right person? Is he the right person? And just go from there. But if we just sit here with our hands, I mean, we got to work together.
No, I mean, I know that you and I have talked about, the future of the U.S. Open. But you're right. Doug Ganem has that middle class sponsor. United Healthcare is a perfect example of a sponsor that speaks to, the type of customer that is playing racquetball. Middle class, everyone needs insurance, right? Not everybody gets it through their job. My wife is a health insurance agent. She sells for U.S. Healthcare, and so she's talking to the same kind of people that are playing racquetball and that are supporting programming. It's a perfect sponsor, and it's probably why they've continued to be sponsored. What happens when Ganem retires? God bless him. He wants to retire. He's been running that for 25 years, and we don't even think about it. It's the biggest event, and and it gets 1,000 people or 800 people or whatever it gets. And man, I hope it doesn't go away. I hope they find somebody that can maintain the sponsor relationships that he has, to maintain the relationships he has with, the Minnesota Timberwolves or the city of Minneapolis or wherever he's, gotten in tight with, to be able to use the facilities there, and I'm really worried about that personally.
Yeah, we all are, I'm sure. And to be fair, I mean, there's been, the history of the game suds. It's, there were some big events and there was some big money involved in the late 70s and early 80s. So, in our history, when we're in tune with it more, I think Doug Ganem's been that only person, but there are some in the past that would deserve recognition on that level. And some of the older pros would be able to speak to that for sure. In a perfect world for me, in terms of racquetball current times is, relationships and having relationships build and continuing to build on that. And a lot of it revolves around speaking Spanish. Let's be really honest here, to get into international play, who is on the boards or who is in the leadership roles with the tours that's speaking Spanish, that can connect and build relationships with companies in Latin America, in the various countries, with the right racquetball people that are there. And the other thing I'll say is, sometimes you think you're talking to the right person in Bolivia and maybe you're not. Maybe you're talking to the person who's good at getting that contact going, but isn't always well loved down there, or whatever country you want to put in play there. So, you have to learn about it and you have to take time to do that and build relationships. So I would, I'd encourage both tours to have that as something on their mind right now going forward, because there has to be stops internationally. These are international tours, and current, obviously the best players are coming from Central and South America. So, there just has to be stops after COVID's over going forward with that. So, in a perfect world, that's happening. So, moving on a little bit here and trying to get in some other topics going, but, for me, it's similar still, but, what I have written here is, what associations, organizations, and racquetball excite you the most currently, and which ones are disappointing you the most, and why?
Well, up until COVID, I was most excited by what the IRT has done. I think that the new ownership group stabilized the sport. They expanded. They were able to expand in their first season in charge, expand the number of events, bring a ton more players in. They brought in, for example, the Longhorn Open. They got them under the fold. They got the Sun Prairie event under the fold. I mean, those guys were never tier one events, and suddenly they're tier ones. And we have, and they were able to expand on, the event in Fargo and blah, blah, blah. So I like that, especially as a fan of the sport, looking for the new players. Disappointing. I mean, it's got to be what's going on with WAR. I think that since the acquisition of WAR, there just has been so little done in terms of organizing, in terms of website, in terms of notification. And I'm not the only one saying this. If you read Freddie Ramirez's content on his webpage, he's poking at this all the time. If you ask any of the guys that are running the three major events, specifically Vic Coulter or Jesus and
Jeff Osborne or Jeff. Jeff.
None of them are
not Osborne, but Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff and Jay in Southern California.
Right.
They're not happy with what's going on. Freddie pointed out in particular, we finally have an event, right? After months and months of having no events, you have this big Vegas event, 3-wall ball. There was not a single update on the website. There was not a post that went out. There was nothing. And a lot of the people that were volunteering their time because Hank Marcus convinced them to do so, have basically been like, I'm out, and so, the guy that maintains the court list, Bill George, is he still involved?
Yeah.
Is he still doing work? I don't know.
Probably so.
Probably, because he loves it.
Yeah,
But,
he does. Good guy.
There's no updates. Who's
Right.
updating the rankings, right?
Right.
Who's
Right.
updating the tournament list? Who's updating anything with them? And so that's
Well,
that's
presumably it's USA Racquetball's job now, and maybe that whole connection there is fallen off, and they're waiting for the same thing to happen from USAR.
No, you're right. And so the people in USAR who are involved, they're not going to dispute what I just said, and it's not criticism of them, because they're volunteers who volunteered because they see a gap and because they want to try to help and get it back.
Todd, I can't say enough. What you do for the sport. You're a fascinating individual in our sport, and you have so much knowledge and so much to add. So I have to ask this. Where do you see yourself, or what role in our sport do you see as like a perfect fit for Todd Boss?
I mean,
and don't be shy. And don't.
Yeah, the way I had the question written is, first off, are you on any boards within the sport? And if so, why not? And it kind of feels like a similar question is what I'm asking. Is that what else should you be doing here, that because you know so much and you love the sport and you want to be involved?
Well, so for those of you that don't know, when I do the data entry to the tournaments, I don't just do the data entry. I put out these long-winded previews and wrap-ups of the event, right? And so and those have turned into these 1,000-word missives that I'm writing as a fan, right? And so as a result of writing these things, I have been approached by Daryl Key at the National Board, who's kind of the new war leader, to help write some stuff. And so those of you in the USAR may have seen some content from me. I wrote the recent wrap up of the Vegas event, and I've done, some stuff here and there. But that writing led Daryl to ask me to do basically a larger writing project, and he wanted me to write the history of war. I was like, okay, that sounds cool. So I figured I'd just call up Hank, and he'd tell me the whole war story, and it would be a few pages, and that'd be that, right? Well, after a couple of conversations with Hank, he was like, well, he told me the whole story from beginning, from cradle to grave. But then he's like, well, to understand the Vegas thing, you really need to talk to Mike Coulter. And to understand Beach Bash, you really need to go talk to Vic and maybe Scott Hirsch, who started it, kind of was involved before Vic. And you really need to go talk to the outdoor guys who run Southern California to see. And so suddenly I had 6 other interviews. He's like, oh, by the way, you really got to go talk to Freddie because he's New York, and you can't tell the story of outdoor without New York. So all of a sudden I'm 10 interviews deep, and my document is 25 pages long. And every time I talk to one guy, I got to talk to 3 more. I now have 150 pages written of what is going to be a book, and it's going to be the history of outdoor racquetball from soup to nuts. And I'm trying to talk to every significant person that's had a hand in outdoor programming or outdoor racquetball, from literally the day it was invented on the campus of Orange Coast College in '72 to today. So that's my new project.
So how deep are you into that? I mean, how many interviews are you into something like that?
40.
Oh shit.
43 interviews in, I think.
So which one was the most informative and also entertaining, let's say,
Most informative. Well, obviously Hank, because he had the context, but then talking to Scott Winters and then talking to Mike Martinez was also equally illustrative for a number of different reasons. Talking to Mike Coulter was fantastic. I think you guys have talked to Mike. It's hard to get a word in edgewise, but the story of him, everything that he went through to get that tournament going is fascinating. And it was so fascinating that I think his section of the document is like 8 or 9 pages. And I sent it to him because my MO is I interview, then I write, and then I send to them for final edit and review. Because some of these people are telling me, yes, it's racquetball. So some of these people are talking about really political things, and I didn't want to. I'm Switzerland, right? I don't want to step on toes. I don't want to. This is not a political book. This is not a political hit piece or criticism. This is a history, right? So I send it to Coulter. He loves it so much he sticks it on the website, right? Now it's like now anybody can go. If you go to 3wallball.com right now, you can click on basically an excerpt of this book, and it tells the whole story of how he got Vegas started, and it's amazing. You know, he got all of his construction buddies. They did all this research. They did test builds. There used to be a VP at the Stratosphere Hotel who was tight and played racquetball, and they twisted arm here and there, and suddenly. They gotta take all that equipment and stick it into a shipping container to store it for 51 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
They had to arrange that. They had to make sure that they bought materials that wouldn't rust in the shipping container. That story was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I think I got Rocky's whole story. I haven't had a chance to talk to Hawks yet. I talked to Bill Wallace. That was pretty special.
I don't know who that is.
Bill Wallace invented outdoor racquetball. Bill Wallace and is a teacher, or he was a professor at Orange Coast College, and he had a fellow professor named Bob Wetzel. They were PE teachers, but they were big handball guys, and they had a regular game. They were state champion handball players. They would go up and down the East Coast, and as it turns out, they had a regular Tuesday night handball game with R.O. Carson and R.O.'s brother, whose name is escaping me. I think it was Rich. R.O. Carson is Rocky Carson's father, in case anyone didn't understand the implication. So these four guys are playing handball all the time. R.O., who I also talked to, so this is kind of a mix of the two interviews, by the way. R.O. injures his shoulder in a handball tournament. All right, and so in handball, you got to be able to use both hands, right? So he injures his left hand. So he can only really use his right hand, but he wanted to play, but you can't really play handball with one hand. So he'd been hearing about these guys playing racquetball. So he gets his hands on a bunch of these old wooden racquetball rackets from back in this is 72 circa. And he shows up on their Tuesday night game and he goes, "Hey, we should play this thing called racquetball." And so the four of them, instead of playing handball that day, they basically take their handball, the hard rubber handball of the day, and they played racquetball. And they played it with the same rules as handball, same scoring, same service rules where you had to get it over the short line and blah, blah, blah.
Sounds like New York paddleball.
They were hooked. R.O. said he never played handball again in his life. And we're talking, and he was a significantly good tournament handball player.
Yep.
In the meantime, Wallace and Wetzel were PE teachers at the college. And they were teaching all kinds of racket sports. They were teaching squash and tennis and this and that. And they're like, we should teach a racquetball class. And so what happened is these guys started playing down at the courts, and Orange Coast College had like 20 of these freaking handball courts.
Right.
Suddenly they're down there playing. People come by and they're like, "Hey, we want to play that." They walk down the street. They get a couple of these rackets. Suddenly there's all these people playing outdoor racquetball on the campus of this college. Wallace and Wetzel, they design a course. They design a PE class, to get credits. And the PE class would be taught all day, and then these kids would go down and play all night. And suddenly, there's 20 courts filled with people playing this outdoor racquetball sport. Because these guys who were used to running tournaments of their own, they used to run the state handball tournament. They started running outdoor racquetball tournaments. First in 73, they had the California State, and then they realized no one else is running a tournament. So at 74, on 4th of July weekend, I believe, is when they always had that tournament. They had the first national outdoor racquetball tournament, which is cool. Hey, it's like, but they wanted to get it. They wanted to have more than just the guys that were living in Southern California playing this thing. So they went to Kendler. And they said, "Hey, we know that there's this budding racquetball professional tour that are indoor players. We want to get all these guys to come and play in our tournament. We want them to come and play outdoor." And Kendler's like, "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Why don't you go drive down to San Diego and talk to this guy Brumfeld?" So they drive to San Diego and they convince Charlie and Charlie's frequent doubles partner, who was Dr. Bud. right? So
Right.
Dr. Bud and Charlie, they were basically they were undefeated as a doubles team in paddleball and racquetball for 15 years. Convinced them that they got to go play. Charlie and them, they convinced the rest of the guys on tour to go play. So now they've got all these commitments from all these top players. And so if you look at the draw for the 74 world, the first outdoor nationals, and I'll pull up the singles draw real quick while I'm sitting here. But it was basically a who's who of racquetball at the time. They had Brumfeld, they had Surratt, they had Strandemo was there, I think. And they even had a 16-year-old precocious Marty Hogan in the draw, who was just starting to play pro events, while he was still in high school.
Right.
And that's basically who Barry Wallace is. They ended up losing in the doubles final to Brumfeld and Dr. Bud, but beat him in 75, and then ended up winning it a couple more times before he retired. They retired from the sport in 79, 80. Now, interestingly, I asked why Wallace stopped playing and why he stopped running the national events. And you know what he told me? He said that by 79, the sport had changed so much, because by that point you had guys like Hogan who were hitting 140, and Hogan won outdoor national singles, I believe, in 78 or 79. He won it in 78, and I think he was the finalist in 79, but I don't quote me on that. Wallace the sport had changed. It had gone from being like this offshoot of paddleball or handball, where it was very tactical, and as it's the same thing that was going on in the indoor game. And what happened was, in Wallace's opinion, was the game wasn't as approachable for people that had never played it before. It was too fast. They'd go down and watch it, and there was all these kill shots, and players were playing below the waist as opposed to these tactical lobs that were hitting the top of this wall and falling way back. And he said, we went from filling up, dozens and dozens of iterations of the racquetball PE to running 1 or 2 per semester because the demand just wasn't there.
Right.
And I don't know what the lesson there is there, because racquetball is what it is. It is now a fast-paced, hit it low and an athletic endeavor. I don't think you can go back to that.
I'm going to throw this out there, and coming from me, I know a lot of people think I'm crazy when I say this. There was a time when I was away from the sport, and I said what I would do is I would actually take away the kill shot and put like a 6-inch tin on the front of the wall, and say, go play there. Let's see what happens now.
Yeah. Like there's a lot of people who talk about, how to fix racquetball. And what you hear a lot is it's too fast. You can't see it on your little screen on the phone. You can't stream it on Facebook Live. And it's unapproachable for novices. I taught for 10 years, and I never got that impression. Like when I would have somebody on brand new on the court, and they'd see that, with the proper stroke mechanics, that they could impart power and get that blast, that sound when you hit a ball crisp, that didn't scare them off. That energized them. That's not that.
It's like golf. It's like hitting a good drive in golf. But Todd, it's funny. Some of the projects I'm working on also outside, I'm speaking with a production crew, and they actually say that's just not true. You can produce it properly, and it can look very good on television.
Oh, sure.
If it's done correctly. And then, yes, of course, it takes money. We know that. But, it can be televised. And yeah, there's some things that would have to change. But, I'm working on some things, and who knows if it'll ever happen. We'll see what happens. But there definitely needs to be some changes. We're going to start wrapping it up, Todd, because we've had you all night. We appreciate this. And it's fascinating. This is awesome. And we could definitely go, like Ellie said, just a million different directions. But before I do that, I always let Ellie ask, his final question.
Well, I've got about 15 more to go, so it's hard to
We're
pick
gonna have
which
to.
one
This is
to
part
end
one.
this one.
This is part one of having Todd
Everyone
on.
tends to start to be part one or now part two with some of them, and then and that's a good thing because we have more to talk about, Todd, and we'll keep our notes and we'll keep it ready to go for a future conversation. And being a little bit of the historian out of this group, it's good. I'm having fun here listening to this conversation. I think it's good for Sudsy to know the background of the sport that he's on the mountaintop of. Let's face it. He's one of the four greatest of all time, and a lot of people would put him as the greatest of all time. And so it's good for him to hear this. It's good for me to learn about things and some of the stuff I knew a little bit about already, but so I don't really know where to go with the next question. It's really difficult. I guess just to get into a little bit of the stats, something interesting I've always thought is interesting, and going back for that for a second, but like for you, who would be the top 3 men's and women's players on the Pro Tour that never won one stop?
Never won a stop.
Never won a pro stop, a tier 1 pro stop, a full ranking event, because there's a lot of great players that did not win pro stops, and there's some that only got one, of course. And looking at your list online, there's a lot of great players in that one column, but who's your top 3 for each
Well,
men and women?
So to answer this, I'm going to depend on running one of my reports. So on the site, there's a summary link under the miscellaneous section called Career Season Summaries. And it basically lists everybody by the number of tournament wins, finals, semis, etc.
All right.
So right now, there's 2 guys that never won an event, but they made the finals twice. Craig McCoy and Scott Oliver. And of those 2, I'd probably tell you that I'd go with Craig McCoy, because 6 finals, 12 semis, 22 quarters in his pro career. I mean, that's a significant player who's
Say that one more time. Say that one more time for me, please.
Craig McCoy, without ever winning a tier 1, made 6 finals, 12 semis, and 22 quarters in his pro career.
All right.
So that's a lot of time playing on Saturdays and Sundays.
Yeah.
Without having,
what about Scott too? Since he's my guy, he's the guy. I love the guy. I'm tight friends with him, and he's the guy I got to watch daily at the Racquetball Club.
So Scott's a little bit different. He had a very high peak. He made 6 finals, but only 1 semi, 5 quarters. So what happened was he basically just exploded and really played well, for a short amount of time. Made a bunch of finals, couldn't break through. A couple of the names I threw out, a couple of names I threw out there are probably more recent, that are known to more recent, and I would say Shane Vanderson and Derek Robinson are also in that category. Both of them made significant back ends of tournaments. So Derek, 2 finals, 12 semis, 38 quarters in his pro career.
Right.
Vanderson, 2 finals, 19 times he made the semis.
Right.
Without being able to break through. Both of those guys had big time runs at the U.S. Open. Like I think Derek made a final of the U.S. Open.
Sure, I was his roommate that year. It was cool to be a part of in that little way, and not having anything to do with the actual draw myself. But he was in the zone. It was cool to see him do it.
So here's the same answer for the women's side. Robin Levine.
Yep.
Number one candidate. She was, if you guys remember, a lefty with an unbelievable drive serve. I mean, it disappeared off of her racket.
Yeah, it did.
She made 8 finals without breaking through.
Wow.
But did she lose to Gould every one of them?
Probably so.
Michelle Gould, and the 2 of them would just blast serves at each other, and Michelle was just unbeatable.
I watched her beat her in Houston, though, in the semis of the breakthrough win that she had, and really she got hurt in that match too, that people don't realize, and was never the same in her shoulder after a crazy diving get. I mean, she was the closest thing to Ronda during that era, in terms of how she played and how she brought it.
So the number 2 name may or may not be a familiar one to recent fans, and that would be Laura Fenton. Now, Laura Vanda made 3 finals, 22 semis, on top of a fantastic amateur career with a bunch of singles and amateur doubles titles. And your third name is a current player. Alexandria Herrera has made 4 finals, 15 semis, and never been able to break through.
She's doing good. She's doing good. Yep.
What's amazing about her is week in and week out, she is in the semis. She has had that number 4 ranking for years. She goes up to head against Ronda as the number 5, or maybe sometimes Mendez will get into number 5, but Herrera just is always making the semis. She just never even seems troubled. Then she gets to the semis, she faces Paola, or she faces Vargas, or she faces Salas, and just gets, she gets a win here and there, but for the most time, that ends her run.
Right.
So those are the ones for me.
Very interesting. I think that's a good mixture of the past and the present as well. So you think people would ever play with original rackets again if they were made a little bit better nowadays, a little lighter and a little better? Does original racquetball have a place in any of this current times?
I don't know. I mean, like if if you're interested in that kind of a sport, wouldn't you just be playing paddleball?
Or pickleball. Yeah, I don't see it because I mean, just look at any sport. Every single sport has evolved, right?
Mm-hmm.
And nothing has gone backwards. I mean,
Yeah.
it would just be anti. I get what you're saying, Ellie.
No, I'm not
slowing
saying it.
down.
I'm just asking. I
Yeah,
don't believe in it either, really. But
personally, I don't see a spot for
it's
that.
we're unique guys, and Todd, you're in the same boat where well, I think you are. Maybe you're not quite there, but I started with the Marty, the Marty Hogan
Sure.
Bandito, little Bandito, the white one, and into the 250G blew my mind, and the CBK blew it again, and then we got to develop as teenagers, as getting older teenagers with rackets that were getting into the 21 inches, 21 and a half, 22 inches, and started being able to swing out of our ass. And that was fun. It was very, very addicting, very, it was very attractive to young, powerful, athletic players that were coming up in the game. So, but all of these players who are playing now, for the most part, they haven't experienced that little racket feel and how difficult that is. So, excuse me. It's interesting though.
When was the last? I mean, we've had a 22-inch racket standard for what, 25 years now?
Yeah, about that. It's been a long time, right? So
It's gotta be.
Yeah.
It's for a lot of players, it's the game has changed because of that. The power game isn't quite as prominent because these players grew up as kids with big rackets and they were very light, so they're learning how to swing them to not have their arms fall off. They're obviously training changes everything as well, but for a lot of us, it was just so attractive to just all of a sudden swing out of your mind on drive serves, because going from a 250G to to whatever racket you want to call from the 21 and going forward in Jera, you can just really hit the hell out of the ball. So
Anybody that didn't play with a 250G, I'll sum it up like this. Imagine taking a frying pan and a hammer, holding them together and trying to rip a ball. There's no doubt that my torn labrum has something to do with those years, Ellie. And I know your shoulders.
Well, for me, yeah, I need a replacement. And for me, it's more about when the rackets got big, though, is when the problems started really setting in, because again, the timing of getting older and getting more powerful and then being able to see it, and having guys like Egan and Hogan to Egan and Doyle and Cliff, and seeing all these guys just absolutely crush balls, and realizing you got to be able to do that at some level during our era. And that's why we talk about Jason and his game kind of changing the game back to a little bit more of an old school era, and people having to evolve that way as well. But it's the original racquetball topic. In a perfect world, it has a place for me because it would be such an eye opener. And I think there's a lot of retiree community people that might say, hey, I'm a little more attracted to a ball that's not zinging by my head, and rackets that aren't so big that I can get hit with them.
Pickleball.
I mean, those guys are playing pickleball. I mean,
yeah.
Christ, I play pickleball. Every time I get on a racquetball,
of course you do.
I get hurt.
Yeah, then let's not talk about that one too much, because that reality there scares people away, scares potential new players away, and it's the reality of it.
We're not going to let the famous Todd Boss discuss pickleball tonight, and with that, we're definitely going to come to a close. But Todd, before we let you go, again, thank you so much. We appreciate you coming out and sharing all this info and knowledge with everybody, and just looking at the comments, I know they're loving it, and we definitely do want to have you on again. I appreciate speaking to you offline, which is always a pleasure. We go back and forth. We've been doing that for years. It's a lot of fun. Is there anything else you want to say before you get out of here?
No, I just want to say, hey, thanks for this opportunity. I know that individually, you and I interviewed John for the outdoor project, and Sudsy, you and I chat all the time. And I enjoy this anytime. I'm always going to come on and talk more stats, do a demo of the site, or give you my unsolicited opinion on the future of racquetball as needed.
Well, that's a great idea. I think, you're a huge asset to Racquetball, Todd. Really, I believe that. We support you. We have your back. We know that you're out there for the sport and the betterment of the sport. And there's still some questions that I have. I know Ellie's got a ton also. And who knows where you might be. But again, thank you so much on behalf of all of Racquetball. And for everybody, go check out his site. Go check out the stats. It's pretty cool. It's really fun. And you'll see something that really isn't available by anyone else. Nobody else has ever done it. And that alone is a little disappointing, but Todd, thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Todd.
All right.
Good night.
Night, buddy.
Ellie,
Yeah.
I mean, fascinating. Let me tell you, I even read, a couple of comments. I didn't know where that was going to go tonight, and I'm super excited. That was awesome. That was really, really good.
That's, I could visualize this happening, but you're probably not surprised by that. This is, I'm how I am after these types of shows. I'm a little pissed that we're done already. You and Scott want to get out of here. I'm like, it's only whatever time it is here in Cali. So what, you guys were on the wrong coast. Not my bad. It's only 7:45, and I know the diehard 35 to 50 people that were on watching live are digging it enough, and that's why they're still on. But I understand why we have to go after an hour and 45 minutes of talking racquetball with Todd, and there's the questions I have. We'll save them, and hopefully we have them back on in due time, and we'll ask away in a different way.
Yeah, we could definitely, do repeats. There's no doubt about that. And we love to hear from all of you, everybody that watches, everybody that shares. We see the numbers. It's great. It's important. All of you keep the sport out there. You keep the energy up. You keep it engaged. Beyond the court, Ellie and I and Scotty Mac, we do this for you, really. We don't get paid for this. We're trying to bring you the info and the knowledge. And we appreciate you watching. We hope you have. Ellie has something to say.
Do you want to talk about next weekend at all, since we seem to be there already? Or, it's kind of such an interesting one that, God, I want to talk about a little bit.
Go ahead if you want. You're.
Nah, if you don't want to, then we'll
like
hold on to it then.
If you want to know who's going to be on the show next week, pay attention this week, because we will definitely talk about it.
It's a good one too, and it's an important one, especially during the Thanksgiving and holiday season beginning here. And I think we'll have that kind of theme to it. We've been doing a lot about the GOATs recently, and we'll get back to that. I personally am looking forward to talking to Hogan, Lynn Adams, and other GOATs of the game, Michelle Gould, Brumfield, who I've never even had a conversation with Charlie. So that'll be new for me. But this is a time to maybe get into other aspects of the sport. And I think that was fun tonight for me, Suds. I really enjoyed Todd being on the show, and I look forward to next week's just as much. I got to do some research on him.
It was definitely awesome. So before we go, first thing I want to say is happy Thanksgiving to everybody, and a huge happy anniversary again to Dave and Pat Ellis. On Thanksgiving, 50 years ago this Thursday, you two got married, and what an amazing thing. Thank you for that, because my buddy Ellie's here, and we love you. Everybody in Racquetball loves you. And Daryl Graff shares a anniversary with you guys, but 26 years. Come on, slacker. Only 26 years married.
That's pretty good, man.
That's pretty impressive. So happy anniversary to you as well. Everybody out there in the racquetball world, our friends, our family, have an amazing week. Again, don't forget, we can control two things tomorrow when we wake up: our attitude and our output. All right. So go do them well. Have a great week. Enjoy your Thanksgiving, and we will definitely see you next Sunday.